20th century novel literary criticism 2. Literary theory and criticism. Literary criticism and theory in the 20th century. Now, I explain to you more about this novels and everything. My name is Sangeeta Mehta and you're watching my channel, My English Magazine. Today I explain to you literary criticism. Advertisements. 20th century literary criticism and theory has comprised a broad range of tendencies and a movement, a humanistic tradition descended from 19th century writers such as Matthew Arnold and continued into the 20th century through figures such as Irving Babbitt and F.R. Lewis. Surviving in our own day in scholars such as Frank Kermode and John Creasy, a new romantic tendency expressed in the work of D.H. Lawrence, G. Wilson, Knight and others. The new criticism arising initially in the 1920s and subsequently formalized and popularized in the 1940s the tradition of Marxist criticism traceable to the writing of Marx and Engels themselves. Psychoanalytic criticism, whose foundations were laid by Freud and Jung, Russian formalism, arising in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, structuralism, which emerged fully in the 1950s, building on the foundations established in the early 20th century by Chaucer and Levi Strauss, and the various forms of criticism which are sometimes subsumed under the label of post-structuralism, Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, which revert Freudian concepts, deconstruction, which emerged in the 1960s, as did feminism, reader response theory, whose roots went back to Husserl and Heidegger, and the new historicism, which arose in the 1980s. At the end of the 19th century, criticism in Europe and America had been predominantly biographical, historical, psychological, impressionistic, and empirical. With the establishment of English as a separate discipline in England, many influential critics such as George Saintsbury, A.C. Bradley, and Arthur Conan Koch assumed academic posts in America. Influential theories of realism and naturalism had been propounded by William Dean Howells, Herman Garland, and Frank Norris, an important concern of American critics such as John Macy, Randolph Baum, and Van Wyck Brooks was to establish a sense of national identity through tracing a specifically American literary tradition. In France, the most pervasive critical mode was the explication the text based on close readings which drew upon biographical sources and historical context. In the humanist tradition of Matthew Arnold, much of this philosophical criticism saw in literature a refuge from a remedy for the ills of modern civilization. In both America and Europe, the defenders and proponents of literature sought to preserve the humanities in the educational curriculum against the onslaughts of reformists such as Harvard University President Charles Eliot and John Dewey, who urged that the college education system should be brought into line with prevailing bourgeois scientific and economic interests. The vast political and economic developments discussed above provided the broad context in which the literature and the criticism of the 20th century arose. The humanist tradition of the late 19th century, reacting against the commercialism and philistinism of bourgeois society, was continued and intensified in the polemic of the new humanists led by Harvard professor Irving Babbitt, and including figures such as Paul Elmer, more normal Forrester, and Stuart Sherman. In the new humanists were conservative in their cultural and political outlook, reacting against what they saw as a relativistic disorder of styles and approaches characterizing early 20th century America. They rejected the predominant tendencies stemming from the liberal bourgeois tradition, a narrow focus on the present at the expense of the past, and the tradition unrestrained freedom in political, moral, and aesthetic domains, a rights of pluralism, a mechanical exhalation of facts, and an uninformed worship of science. So these are the now also reacting against the industrialism and rationalism of the bourgeois world were the neo-romantic critics in England, including D.H. Lawrence, G. Wilson, Knight, John Middleton, Murray, Herbert Reed, and C.S. Lewis. Lawrence, 1885 to 1930, was an avowed irrationalist who saw the modern industrial world as sexually repressive and as having stunted human potential. In his own highly idiosyncratic way, Lawrence anticipates the stress on the unconscious, the body, and the irrational motives in various areas of contemporary criticism. In general, these critics attempt to reinstate a romantic belief, a pantheism, and the organic unity of the world, Muri, and an organistic aesthetic which saw poetry as an organic totality transcending reason and the possibility of paraphrases in prose. Muri read their literary analysis subordinated intention and biography to artistic concerns. Wilsonite before the debates about authorial intention and the affective dimensions of literature across the in the new criticism, the scholar E.M.W. Tilliard engaged in a debate with C.S. Lewis in the Personal Heresy 1939. New critical trends were also anticipated in America, where W.C. Bond attempted to establish literary criticism as a serious and independent activity, and when James Gibbons Hooker and H.L. Mencken insisted on addressing the aesthetic elements in art and divorced from moral considerations. Hence, the critical movements of the early 20th century was already moving in certain directions. The isolation of the aesthetic from moral religious concerns, and indeed an exhalation of the aesthetic as a last line of defense against a commercialized and dehumanizing world, and a correlative attempt to establish criticism as a serious and scientific activity. This broadly humanist trend is far away from deed. It is not only has persisted through figures such as F.R. Leaves, but also has often structured the very forms of critical endeavor which rejected. Most of the critical movements associated with literary theory, ranging from the formalism and the new criticism to post-structuralism, arose in the shadow of the calamitous historical events discussed earlier. It should be remembered that such as historical developments bear a complex and other often contradictory relation in literary practice and theory. So in this way, I continue in my another video. Thank you very much all of you. Thank you guys.